What I'd like to do with you this morning is share a wee bit with you about Christian Aid's global work. But before I do that, let me ask you to picture something. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the story of Naomi and Ruth from the Old Testament. And my colleague Leanne Cleland wrote this lovely reflection for Christian Aid Week 2018. So picture this. Naomi is standing at the door of her house, her face and feet warm in the glow of the sun. The babies are playing at her feet, drawing shapes in the sand. They're moaning a little, a plaintive wail, just making its way up from their empty tummies. As far as the eye can see, there are brown fields, dried up crops, shriveled riverbeds. Bethlehem, the house of bread, is not living up to its name. So it's time to go. It's time to leave what can't be changed, can't be grown, can't be eaten, to find something better. It's time to take a risk, to leave all that is familiar and dear in the hope of a table full of food and a life well lived. Naomi and Elimelech gather together all they can carry. Perhaps they use a donkey to bear the extra load. She sweeps out their little house, shuts the door, sets her face towards a better future in a strange land. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 1 person is displaced every second by climate and weather disasters. That's an average of 26 million people every year. People are on the move. So they settled in well. Elimelech brought some cattle. Naomi planted a garden. The boys grew. They celebrated Passover and the neighbours pretended not to stare. They made friends, not lifelong friends yet, but passing acquaintances. It wasn't home, perhaps not even a home from home, but it was better, and that was enough for a while. And then he died. One day he was building a wall to keep the cattle from the crops, and the next the neighbour was carrying him through the garden into the house. And she didn't know how to deal with death far from home. She sat down and she wept. How would she sing the Lord's song alone in a strange land? But time passed, her garden thrived, the boys grew and grew. They fell in love with a couple of local girls and married in a Jewish ceremony with a little local flavour. Or was it a local wedding with a little Jewish flavour? She'd lost track. Her boys, men really, though still boys to her, built a house where they could all dwell. It was windtight, weatherproof. When the winds roared, they believed that they were stronger than the storms. And then the roof fell in. The boys died. The crops were swamped by the rain. Heaven's tears, she said. She had no one to protect and to provide. And if home is where the heart is, did it lie in the ground with her sons and her husband, or back in the land of her ancestors? Naomi and Oprah and Ruth gather together all they can carry. Perhaps they use a donkey to bear the extra load. She sweeps out their little house, shuts the door, sets her face towards a better future in a strange land. When they set forth once more, a cry of grief went up to heaven. The long plaintive wail, like a funeral coronach, was resumed. The sound seemed to re-echo through the whole wide valley in one prolonged note of desolation. Now that cry that you have just heard is not one of biblical proportions. It's not Naomi's wail as she rounds the corner to Bethlehem. It's not the cry of those on sinking ships trying to reach the safety on the far side of the Mediterranean. That cry was the cry of crofters, forced from the valley of Strath during the Highland clearances. They were scattered to the far ends of the earth, eventually sending back letters from America. You see, we know what it is to be displaced. For our mothers and fathers before us were people on the move. More than 65 million people across the world today have been uprooted from their homes. They have left behind their ordinary, everyday lives in a desperate search for food, safety, and somewhere to call home. Millions are escaping war and ethnic persecution. Millions more have had their homes swept away by the increasing number of climate-related disasters. A staggering number of people are being pushed aside to make way for dams, roads, and other large-scale projects. Most are in the world's poorest countries, often among their poorest people. You'll have seen there from the video just a wee bit about how Christian Aid started at the end of the Second World War. Started to support those who had been displaced by conflict, and as our former head of team, Cathy Galloway, said, founded in that belief that practical responses to human suffering should be unconditional, freely offered without coercion, and recognising that costly reconciliation is at the heart of the gospel. Today, Christian Aid is still working around the world with those who have been displaced or who are at risk of being displaced. So here's a wee snapshot. Before the war began in Syria 10 years ago, almost all children were enrolled in primary school. But today, the country's school enrolment rates are amongst the lowest in the world. Young people are also disproportionately affected by catastrophic unemployment rates, which stand at 90% in some areas. So together with local partners, we are ensuring that young people affected by conflict can access education and training. Similar work is happening in Iraq and Lebanon. There, Christian Aid is supporting young refugees, internally displaced people, and host communities to become more resilient through education, psychosocial support, economic empowerment activities, and access to healthcare. In Bangladesh, in refugee camps set up for the Rohingya people fleeing the violence in Rakhine State, Christian Aid has for many years been working to provide decent sanitation. COVID has hit these refugee camps hard this year, and in response we have been educating people about the virus, working to prevent it spreading, and also tackling disinformation. And while millions are displaced due to conflict, many are fleeing their homes as a result of climate change. In the past decade, we have seen more erratic and more extreme weather, and more people forced from their homes and their land because of climate-related disaster. Christian Aid partners are desperate to support people to stay on their land and to make a viable living from it. Over the last decade, we have built storm-resistant homes in Haiti. We've given solar ovens to communities living in the Bolivian Amazon so they could cook even when firewood was soaking wet. We've built homes on stilts in Bangladesh to quite literally lift people out of the floodwaters. In Nicaragua, hotter and wetter weather is destroying the coffee crops. Our partners are helping farmers to diversify to cocoa, which is more resilient to temperature fluctuations. So let's look at two extremes of climate change: prolonged drought and constant flooding. This year's Christian Aid Week stories come from Kenya, where communities are struggling with prolonged periods of drought. Shortage of rain pushes people to the brink as animals and crops die, and people are forced to walk further and further to collect water for their families and their animals. It often falls to the women to do this, many of them walking for hours a day on an empty stomach in order to ensure survival. In Kenya, prolonged periods of drought have been followed by flash flooding that have then washed away any fledgling crops. Communities affected by alternating flooding and drought desperately need a reliable source of water. Without that, they have little choice but to migrate, to be on the move, looking for a viable livelihood elsewhere. So Christian Aid partners have been supporting communities to develop water dams which trap the rainwater when it comes and store that water deep underground. Thanks to these dams, women are freed from the daily chore of walking for hours on end to collect water. Crops and animals are able to thrive, and people are well fed. Being able to plant a variety of seeds also attracts bees, and many in the community have become beekeepers, selling the honey as an additional source of income. Adapting to the new climate reality is essential in keeping people on the land. In Bangladesh, erratic rainfall means that people's fields are flooded and crops die. In the southwest coastal region of the country, land is often saturated with salt water, meaning that it is difficult to grow anything. Again, the pressure is on people to migrate when they come up against this kind of disaster. Our partners have been helping people to adapt to these changes, saline-resistant seeds. Supporting farmers to farm crabs has also been one adaptation, thus using the flooded land to good effect. And it's not just about diversifying to crabs, but also about training people to access their own local markets with the produce to ensure there is a reliable source of income for the family. There is innovative work happening across the globe to support people who find themselves at the sharp end of climate change and conflict. We support people who have been displaced and have done for 75 years, but we also support people to live well on their land. Some of you might have heard me say this before, but one of the most powerful statements I have heard is from a woman in India who was asked whether or not a project had changed her life. After thinking about it for a minute, she replied, "No, it hasn't changed my life, but it has changed my daughter's life." She went on to explain that the reliable income gave her a voice and that she was able to insist that her daughter stayed at school, didn't get married young, and she said, "My daughter's life experience will be different from mine." And it's that generational change that we are invested in because we refuse to accept that poverty is inevitable. So as a people here in Scotland whose history is one of displacement, where our ancestors lived through the harsh realities of making a living from the land, living in tenement slums, we know that change takes time. But we also know that change happens because people demand that it happens. Our freedoms, rights and lifestyles were hard fought for. Christian Aid exists to create a world where everyone can live a full life free from poverty. But we cannot end poverty without addressing the climate crisis and the injustices and inequalities at its roots. The biblical mandate to see that justice is done compels us to speak and to demand something different. So we are calling for a new deal for climate justice, which calls for a limiting of emissions, a move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and financial support for the world's poorest so they can tackle climate change. With COP coming to Glasgow, the time is now to make the changes that the world needs. This climate crisis hurts us all, but the people living in poverty fight the worst of it every day.